You were 20 months.
I just want to introduce my friend Drew Rock, a fellow school counselor in a different district. Used to teach Spanish, now is a school counselor. I met him first when he was a school counseling student, when he gave this fantastic presentation at the All Ohio Counselors Conference, which is kind of the Ohio's premier thing for school counselors and social agency counselors to go for some continuing education and connect with one another. And I just knew that I wanted to know him forever, and that he would be an amazing resource for us as we kind of try to learn a few more things about doing a better job of including our friends that we have traditionally excluded. So, quick prayer if you wouldn't mind. Holy God, thank you for this opportunity to join together in fellowship. Please open our hearts and minds to the teaching that Drew has brought us so that we can do, as Jesus said, a little bit better and love our neighbors. Amen.
Well, welcome everybody. Or, obviously this is your space, not my space, so.
It's your space today.
Right, so today we're just going to discuss some of the basics about gender and sexual diversity. So we can kind of call this a primer for allies. Some of the information that we cover today you may already know, some of it may be news to you, and by the end of the session you may be left wanting more. So there may be a second session or a third session if you so desire. I would love to come back and do that too. Tori already introduced me, so I am a school counselor now. I am a middle school counselor in my third year of doing that. I love it. Wouldn't change it for the world. School year's been a little crazy, but I think that's been the case across the board. So again, just kind of getting excited to go back to some normalcy. All right, so some of the topics that we'll be covering in this presentation will be the basics of gender and sexual diversity, coming out, working with and without families, right, being an ally, and then I've got kind of a list of resources that you can check out if you want to learn more kind of in the different areas of allyship. I've got one, maybe two videos, kind of depending on how long I end up blathering on before you. I'm not very good at keeping presentations brief, so I will apologize if I start to go over or go on a tangent, and just redirect me if you need to. All right, so before we even get started, just a couple of grounding questions. Right? So for all of you, when's the first time you can remember learning that some people are lesbian, gay, or bisexual? Way back?
You knew people, yes.
Yeah.
It was just not an open discussion.
Okay.
When I was in elementary or middle school.
Okay.
And I asked my mom, and she said, yep. That was all she said.
Right, okay. Right now, when's the first time you remember hearing or learning that some people are trans, non-binary, or genderqueer? Right? And it's interesting because no matter which audience I've presented to, the answers are pretty similar, right? Elementary to middle school is kind of when you learn or know about gay people or lesbians or bisexuals in the world, right? But this idea of gender identity has been kind of a new movement as far as I don't want to say civil rights, but social rights and recognition and representation. There has been a lot more acceptance in today's society than there was in the past. Obviously, if we go back through history, these folks have always existed, right? But the conversations about them and the inclusion hasn't always been there, right? So the goal kind of today and through all of the presentations and things that I do, my main objective is just to educate and teach people to open their hearts and understand and not be afraid of the unknown, right? The more you learn about something, the less fear you have over it. Right, so now that we've kind of addressed those two questions, what contributed to the basis of your initial impressions and understanding of LGBTQIA+ people?
I think knowing people that were and
and then finding out and knowing they're still the same person.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. Anybody else?
I had a friend in high school who I was in the flag corps with, and
Okay.
she was already out-ish and had a girlfriend who was also someone I knew. We weren't close friends, but just kind of being around them.
Right. Okay.
I think knowing people, but also like the media and shows, like growing up, play a large role in it.
Right.
Probably stereotyping it too, but unfortunately, but
Exactly. Yeah.
like
So.
your impression of it.
Yeah, for sure.
I think my initial impressions, and I'm talking about when I was quite young, were unfortunately because of jokes.
Okay. Yes. And
So my initial impressions were there was something to make a joke about,
right.
which obviously changed that. But
Right. Yeah, and kind of on the flip side of that, some people learn about it from, bullying and harassment. The first time they've ever heard the word may have been a classmate calling them gay for whatever reason, as an insult. Right? Again, like the idea behind all of this is education, right? You may be getting some knowledge and understanding from folks that you know, and that's obviously the best way to learn about people or a group of people is connecting with them and forming those relationships and exposing yourself to parts of their world that you otherwise wouldn't be exposed to, right? But unfortunately, a lot of people are limited in their background and their exposure and their education, limited to, again, what's happening in the schoolyard or what you're hearing in classes or what you see on TV. And though we've come a long way, a lot of what we used to see in media wasn't always the best portrayal of folks from this community. So again, you see a lot of stereotypes, or you see them being kind of the butt of the joke in the show or the program or whatever it is. So again, knowing that knowledge is what's going to open our hearts, and knowledge is what's going to get us to understand people better. We've got to expose ourselves to more than just the limited areas and views that we may be seeing in what we are just naturally exposed to, right? So you've got to kind of put in the work to really have it pay off. Right. So getting into it, the first section we're going to talk about the basics of gender and sexual diversity, and for this next segment, my friend Bill Nye, the science guy, has a short clip, right? I'm sure all of you are familiar with him. He's actually kind of rebranded himself and now does like an internet show series for adults, but they can also be used for educating younger folks as well. So we'll take a look at what Bill has to say, and then we'll kind of start discussing after that.
One thing's clear about sexuality. There's a lot more going on than meets the eye. Female or male, gay or straight, pink or blue. We were taught to see these as binary. Now we're realizing it's more like a kaleidoscope. And this stuff isn't just for adults. Parents know this already. Kids explore gender, expression, attraction before they've ever heard of a spectrum. Take sex. We used to think it was pretty straightforward. X and a Y chromosome for males, 2 X's for females. But we see more combinations than that in real life. And even for people with just 2 sex chromosomes, hormones can vary wildly. So can anatomy. What makes someone male or female isn't so clear-cut. How about attraction? Some people argue natural thing is to only be attracted to the opposite sex. But in practice, it ain't so simple, kids. Some people are gay, some are bi, some are asexual, and some will take whatever they can get. You know what I mean? It's another sexy sliding scale. When you throw in gender, it gets even more colorful. By 3 or 4, most kids identify with a gender, and it doesn't always match the sex they were assigned at birth. And a person's gender identity may change over their lifetime. And culture is getting us new ways to express all of this. How you dress, how you act and talk, how you present yourself to the world. It should be up to you. Sure, this might make things confusing for those who insist everyone pick an M or an F. People, we have to listen to the science. And the science says we're all on a spectrum. Our our labels, our fashion, even our washrooms are still catching up to that truth. I think you'll find when we look at sexuality this way, it is more complicated, but it's also a lot more honest, and it's more interesting. I learned a lot tonight. I mean, I'm this cis male guy who's been living in this world. But this stuff, to me, from a scientific standpoint, is just cool. Science is the process by which we understand nature, by which we understand our place in the world, how we all fit in. And so every one of these insights is just so exciting for me. We, working together, can, dare I say it, save the world. So everybody, that's our show.
Right, so again, just kind of the basics, but I really loved just the illustrations that he used, how, the color and the way everything changes, right? And he's exactly right. We exist on a spectrum, right? So that's the piece that we're going to get into first is the idea of the spectrum. But first, we do have to make a distinction, right? Gender identity is not sexual identity, right? So when we're talking about, gender, that is just the idea of male, female, and anything in between, right? Sexuality has to do with attraction, whether it be physical or romantic attraction, right? And we'll kind of get into some of the particulars about that, right? So while members of the LGBTQIA+ community are often grouped together under a similar umbrella, we do have to make that distinction, right? Because somebody may identify as transgender, but still may identify as heterosexual, right? So a transgender woman may be attracted to a cisgender man, so that person would still be a heterosexual person. So again, there is that distinction between gender identity and sexual identity. And often, because of the conflation of the two, right, people often think that these are inappropriate conversations to have, right? And we hear that a lot of times in the news, especially now, right? We can't talk about pronouns with kids. We can't talk about gender identity with kids. Well, we're not talking about the sex part. We are talking about just who you are as a person, right? With no regard to anybody else in your life. You're not looking at anybody else, right? You were just looking within. Who are you, right? That is your gender identity. Your sexual orientation is a totally different thing, right? That has to do with your desires and your actions and your emotions and your feelings and everything involved in that piece, right? So again, when we do have these conversations, we do have to keep in the back of our mind that, we've got to break that stigma of, we can't talk about this to certain people, or so-and-so is too young to understand this or to have a conversation about this. But as our friend Bill and I said, right, children already identify a gender for themselves around the age of 4, right? Some of them sooner, some of them later. But I mean, we see children walk into one of the Sunday school classrooms, and you can see, right? They know who they are, right? Or at least they're beginning to know who they are, so they understand more about themselves in the world, right? So if we think about another one of the kind of big trends or the big terms that we're going to hear, we've got the idea of binary and non-binary, right? Well, if we go back to like the common use of binary, we're talking like computer code, right? You've got the ones and the zeros. I know nothing about computer coding. That's as far as I go. But the idea there is, right, bi, two, right? So in traditional thought and society and culture, we assume that there's only, there are only two options, or you have to be male, or you have to be female, you have to be gay, or you have to be straight. But the fact is, we exist on a spectrum, right? And we can't just put everybody inside of a box, right? Because how we may feel and identify in one context may be different in another context, right? And a lot of that has to do with the folks around you, the environment that you're in, if you feel safe, if you don't feel safe. All of that is going to impact how you kind of present yourself to the world. So a couple of the different pieces of the human sexuality and gender spectrum. We have gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual orientation, right? So gender identity is what's going on the inside. That's who you feel you are, right? So identity inside. Gender expression is what you put out to the world. It's how you show what you feel inside, right? So it could be the clothing that you wear, it could be your mannerisms, your your gait, your accent, even in some cases, right? Some people kind of change the way they talk based on who they're with, right? And this isn't limited to the LGBTQIA community, right? There's a term called code switching, where you kind of modify how you're talking based on the people around you. If I'm in a professional meeting, I'm obviously going to, watch some of the things that I say because I don't want to insult maybe a principal or a fellow counselor or anybody else kind of in that professional circle, right? But if I'm just talking with my friends on a Saturday night, the conversation may look a little bit different, right? So again, the expression, that's what you're putting out to the world. Biological sex, this would be your organs, right? Your hormones, your chromosomes. And again, there's no one or the other with this, right? And what we have kind of in between, an outdated term that some people may be familiar with is hermaphrodite or hermaphroditic, coming from the Greek language. But now the appropriate politically correct term would be intersex, right? And when we're talking biological sex, this typically is the birth certificate, right? So that's what a doctor is going to mark on the birth certificate when you're born. There's no input from you. There's no input necessarily from your mother, right? Especially if we go back a few decades, right? A lot of the doctors in the delivery rooms would make decisions without even consulting with the parents, right? And that's especially true of intersex babies, right? Those that may have ambiguous genitalia or who don't necessarily look the way you might typically expect a baby boy or a baby girl to look like, right? So these physicians were often forced to make a judgment call based on what they think, right? And if we go back a few decades, they would even take it a step further sometimes and perform corrective surgeries. And this would happen even without the parents' consent, right? Because their assumption was, well, this baby is going to lead a better life if we, assign a gender for them and kind of put them in this box so that they know who they are, right? Well, science and psychology and everything else has taught us over the years that it's not that easy, right? So again, if we are looking at the spectrum, you've got male, you've got female, but in between that would be somebody who might identify as intersex, right? And then sexual orientation, this has to do with your connection with others. Again, we are not on a binary here, right? You're not just gay or straight, you're not lesbian or straight, you're not even necessarily just bisexual, right? So even that bi and bisexual has become a little bit outdated, right? And when we talk about sexual orientation, this is another thing that we have to think hard on because we're not necessarily talking about sex, right? So we say sexual orientation, but we're not talking about the actual physical act all of the time, right? Sometimes maybe, but not always. So you have your physical attraction, you have your romantic and emotional attraction, and maybe even like a spiritual and emotional attraction, depending on how you identify and how you interact with the world. And again, these are on a binary, so maybe you are physically attracted to cisgender males, but you are emotionally attracted to females, right? Or people who are assigned male or female at birth. If we break them down into kind of two categories for sexual orientation, typically we look at the romantic and emotional orientation and then the physical and actual sexual orientation. But again, we are not just putting people in one of two categories. They could be anywhere along the continuum. And their kind of marker on the continuum could shift, overnight or over years or, even maybe in the middle of a day, right? A lot of this just depends on the context in which you find yourself. And, when we think about this, even though we're talking about gender and sexual identity here, we can apply some of these ideas, again, to other populations, right? Whether we're talking about age or socioeconomic status or, anything like that. The way you are presenting yourself and the way you interact with people may be different based on your connections with them and kind of the energy that they put off or, the relationships that you have. So again, coming back to this, we don't want to over-sexualize the idea of sexual orientation. And again, if we think back to addressing this notion with children, people think, well, this is inappropriate. We should not be talking about sexual orientation with kids. I agree in part, right? We should not be talking about the physical act in front of kids, right? Save that for a later appropriate time, right? But sexual orientation isn't just about sex, right? If we're talking about attraction, how many of you in here have heard somebody ask a kindergartner after the first day of school, oh, do you have a boyfriend yet? Do you have a girlfriend yet? Okay, that's actually sexualizing the child, more so than saying, I think my child might be gay, or I think my daughter might be lesbian, or, so it's kind of the speaker that's putting that on the kids, not necessarily the person who's trying to talk about that issue with them, right? Because in our society, the assumption is that you are heterosexual and that you're cisgender, right? Cisgender is the identity of somebody, their gender identity, that does not have a conflict between the sex that was assigned at birth, right, what's on the birth certificate, and their gender identity, what they feel inside, right? So cisgender, heterosexual is the norm. But again, what's normal, right? If we're thinking about any topics, we can't always assume that that's, where we fall. Sorry, question.
I'll just contribute that probably 4 or 5 years ago, I had a kindergarten student who was cis female, but felt absolutely certain that he was born to be a boy. And in working with him and his mom, his mom really, really was struggling and just trying to support him. That was tricky, but it was so informative to me to think that at 5, we have a child born with girl parts who is absolutely certain he's a boy. So,
Right.
I've experienced that.
Yes. Yeah, and thank you for sharing, right? And maybe touching on the other side, right? You touched on gender identity. If we talk about sexual identity and sexual orientation, just last week, we had a situation with my son at school. Not like this past Friday, but before, he didn't want to go to school Friday when my husband went to drop him off. And I was busy at work, things were kind of falling apart in the building, and I get a phone call from my husband. He says, Kieran didn't want to go to school today. He said he's being bullied at school. And it turns out it was because, the kiddos at his 4-kid table group in the classroom, at one point, he mentioned that he has 3 dads, right? So me, I'm his biological father, my husband, but I was previously married to their mother, right? And she remarried, and so there's a stepfather on that side. We've got the bonus dad on my side, and then I'm the dad, right? And he didn't understand why it was such a big deal that he has 3 dads. He was proud of it. But then somebody at his table mentioned something about it, and he couldn't take it. So then I did what a father and a counselor would do, and reached out to the school and just said, hey, this is what's going on. I only have these details. What can we do to help him? Right? We want him to want to go to school, and I immediately felt terrible because I'm like, oh my gosh, this is my fault that he's feeling this way, because if I wasn't who I am, he wouldn't be dealing with this. But then I had, to snap back to it, because that's not the thought process that you can get into when you're trying to help your child, right? So the next day, because one of the kids at the table was absent, when my son went back, the counselor and the teacher and they have a discipline person. They're not quite a dean of students, but I guess similar at their elementary school. And they had a conversation with my son, one of the other boys at the table who was being picked on, and then one of the girls at the table. And one of the girls at the table said, well, I wasn't actually the one making fun, but I admit that I didn't stand up for him. And she said, I was scared to stand up for him because I'm a lesbian. Okay, a 5th grader identifies herself as a lesbian, which she may not know the entire scope of that word, but she knows that she's not heterosexual, right? So she, there was that misunderstanding. My son thought that she was kind of against him, and she was just kind of being a quiet bystander. And you can't really blame her, because if she's seeing that somebody's being made fun of because their dad, or their 3 dads, if I identify like this, what's going to happen to me, right? And then the 4th kiddo from the table came back on Tuesday, and they had a conversation with that student, and things are good now. The school did a really good job of handling it. They did almost almost like a social justice session where instead of punishing the children, you educate them and hope that they make a better decision next time. And he's been back to normal. Loves school again, and but just that one day was terrible for him and broke my heart. But again, just an anecdote to show that we can't just focus on age and say that these conversations are inappropriate because kids don't understand. Kids understand a lot more than we give them credit for. And I know there are a lot of things that my kids know that I don't know, right? So always kind of keep that in mind, and if you come against somebody who's adamant that you can't be having these conversations with kids, we've got at least 2 examples that disprove that notion. So kind of a creative way of conceptualizing all of this. Some of you may have seen this before. It's the gender unicorn. And it gives us an illustration of specifically what these different pieces of identity are, right? And you'll notice we've got 3 kind of lines for each, right? We start at 0 and then go all the way up to infinity and beyond. And first we start with gender identity. And again, that's what's in the brain. It's how you identify yourself. It's who you think you are, who you know you are. And we've got 3 categories in this case because we're breaking the binary, right? So we've got female, woman, girl, male, man, boy, and other gender or other genders, right? So again, the traditional female, you may not identify as female at all. So your little marker on the scale would be at the very end, right? Male, man, boy, maybe you're not like traditionally super masculine football player, so you identify yourself maybe partway through, right? Whereas the head quarterback who's strong and believes in who he is and knows who he is and knows that he's cisgender male, maybe he's probably off the charts, right? And then again, we've got other genders. So we've got that idea of being in between, right? But then there's also the idea of being agender, right? Meaning you don't really have a gender or identify with a gender, right? We've got gender fluid, where in some contexts you identify as a certain gender, but in others you identify as a different gender, right? And for some people that can be pretty confusing. You're like, well, why don't you just give them a different label that's all-encompassing, right? But again, the idea is, well, maybe when I'm with all of my guy friends, I do feel a little more masculine. But if I'm hanging out with all of my friends that are girls, maybe I do feel a little more feminine, or those pieces of my identity tend to shine through, right? So again, identity, that's kind of all on the inside. Gender expression, that's what you put out to the world. And again, you could have a marker all the way up here on feminine. I could have come here in a ball gown, right? And that would be traditionally feminine, right? But that would be how I would be expressing my gender identity. I didn't do that, right? Not for any particular reason, but I do identify as a cisgender male, right? So again, cisgender would, if we're looking at feminine and masculine, these, whatever's up here would match up with what's down here, right? So if you identify as female, then typically you would express yourself as female if you're cisgender, right? But again, we've got everywhere in between. So we've got gender fluid, we've got agender, transgender, a lot of kind of different pieces. So again, remember, this is kind of a sliding scale. Now down here we've got fewer options because this is sex assigned at birth. Remember, that's something we really don't have control over. That's something the doctor gave us. And in this case, typically, we're going to go with what you see on birth certificates. And some states have updated their laws, and there is another gender marker on the birth certificate. But most of them are still under the binary. But you may have female, male, other, or intersex, right? Again, depending on the documentation that you're working with and the state that you're in. Now below this line, right, we've got parts, we've got our physical attraction and our emotional attraction. And again, right, you've got women, men, or other genders who don't fit into that binary. And the idea between physical attraction, that is your attraction to that physical aspect of love, right? So that would be technically the sexual piece that we probably wouldn't address with children, right? Or if we do so at a developmentally appropriate level, right? But emotional attraction, right, that's a lot different, right? We can be emotionally attracted to anybody and not want to have sex with them, right? So typically, in, I guess, adult audiences, the way that I tend to conceptualize this is physical attraction is who you want to go to bed with. Emotional attraction is who you want to wake up next to, right? Because there tends to be a bigger bond that doesn't have to be physical with, you know, the emotional attraction. Right? So again, the unicorn illustrates that there are different aspects of gender identity, expression, and even physical and emotional attraction. And again, the kind of marker, if you are using this to measure yourself, it doesn't always end up in the same place, right? Even for those of you who identify as heterosexual cisgender, right? Well, maybe you love to wear sweatpants, and that's not typically considered to be what a girl would wear to work or whatever the case is, right? Again, even if you don't feel like you're doing anything earth-shattering, by wearing something that would be typically male, right, and you are assigned female at birth and identify as female, you're doing your own thing to kind of break that gender binary. Yes?
I was just gonna add something. So along the middle sex assigned at birth too, it's definitely more complicated than that. You know, now that we can test with self-DNA in babies and parents get the information, and sometimes it's a mosaicism where like 20% is XY of their cells and 80% are XX, and it's like, what do you do with that information? And
Exactly.
it's kind of fluid in that sense too.
Yeah. And I had, in a presentation similar to this, I had a whole section on gender identity and like the science behind it. So thank you for sharing. And that is, you know, definitely true, right? It's not always just what you're seeing, right? You may see physical parts that look to be this gender or that gender, but beneath the skin, there's so much else going on, right? All right, so when we're talking about coming out, kind of transitioning from the basics to a big stage in somebody's life who identifies as LGBTQIA+, important to know that it's a lifelong process, right? You typically hear about people coming out and, well, when did you come out? Well, this date. Okay, but then this date, and then this date, and then this time, and that time with this person and that person, and so your journey through like the coming out process is lifelong, right? Before we get into this though, does anybody have questions about the first part? The basics? Okay, move it.
We may just have to have you back for questions because I feel like this vocabulary is so rich.
Okay.
I heard you 4 years ago. I try to read and keep up professionally, but I know I'm going to go home today and think, well, what about this? You know, so yeah.
And you can always reach out in between too,
Yeah,
right?
and know that that's an option. We can definitely have your back sometime for our follow-up questions.
Yeah, I have a question actually.
Yeah.
Is gender non-binary the same as age?
So non-binary would just mean that they don't pick one necessarily. So non-binary could be agender, but it could also be slightly feminine or kind of feminine and masculine, whereas agender would be like androgynous, if you will. Like there's no identifying piece that would make you present as male or female traditionally. Other questions? No. Okay. So when you are interacting with folks who identify as LGBTQIA, we've got a little chart here, the stages of coming out. This was proposed, I believe, back in the 60s or 70s by Vivian Capps, and it's still extremely important and pretty standard today and applicable, right? So whenever we're talking about stages of anything, right, know that, first of all, you don't always go in a logical order. It's not always sequential. You know, folks may start out at the third stage. Folks may start out at the first stage, skip the second stage, go into third stage, go back to the second stage, and you know, so your kind of placement on the stages of coming out may not always follow the same path as everybody else. And again, this is not static, right? It's not like you've reached this level, you've leveled up, and you're never looking back, right? There are always going to be things that may make us question our identity or kind of wonder who we are. So the way the model goes, we start with identity confusion, right? And typically, if we are kind of going chronologically, if we're looking at maybe a standard or typical LGBTQIA plus person, they would more or less follow this path, right? But not always, right? So identity confusion, could this be who I am? So maybe it's a middle schooler who goes to a middle school dance for the first time and they went with, as a heterosexual partner or couple. And, at the end of the dance, they, hug each other goodbye and kind of go about their lives. And, then that person is sitting at home thinking, well, that didn't feel right. Maybe I'm not heterosexual. Maybe I am, but maybe I'm not. What could I be? There wasn't a spark, right? Was that spark just because I wasn't attracted to that person, or was it something bigger, right? So it's just kind of, you're dipping your toes in, kind of realizing that maybe you're not heterosexual, maybe you're not what everybody expects you to be. Then we've got identity comparison. Maybe this is who I am, but maybe this is temporary, right? So I'm young, I'm a ninth grader now, and I think I'm attracted to people of the same gender, but maybe not. I don't know. I've not had much experience in the dating world, so I don't know. Maybe I am, but maybe I just need more experience to know where I am, right? Identity tolerance, right? Then you find out I'm not the only one, and this is where representation is so important, right? And it's one of the biggest reasons why positive representation in media and everywhere else out in the world is so important, because at this point, once somebody realizes I'm not the only one, that is one of the first freeing experiences, right? Knowing that, okay, maybe I'm different, but I'm not so different that I'm the only one like this in the world and I'm a terrible person. No, there are other people out there like me, right? And then identity acceptance, okay? We're getting to the point where, okay, I know that there are other folks out there like me, and I think I'm okay with me being like that. So in this case, this is kind of where folks start aligning themselves with the community. If we want to talk about advocacy and who the most vocal folks are for the community, it starts right around this phase, the identity acceptance, right? Because there's a community for you, even if you're not ready to jump into it quite yet. You know that it's there. Maybe you're not ready because it's not safe, right? Maybe you live in a house where your parents are not accepting, and it would be dangerous for you to come out to your parents. Well, unfortunately, it's probably best to wait until you're 18 and independently living, but knowing that there are people that you can turn to if you have questions, or if you are struggling with who you are. Identity pride, right? This is who I am, and I'm not afraid to show it. This is like the whole coming out piece, right? This, when you think of like the Pride Parade, this is this stage of Pride. Often, with a lot of folks who come out later in life, this is their second adolescence, right? Because when we think about a heterosexual adolescent going through the whole cycle of hormones and dating and relationships and everything, they have that experience. You kind of do your dating, and then you eventually find somebody to settle down with, and you live the rest of your life. Well, maybe you started that because you felt compelled to be in a heterosexual relationship because of what your parents said or what everybody around you said, and finally you get to a point where that's not me, and I want to live authentically, and this is who I am. So sometimes the identity pride phase involves some risk taking, right? So that's really the part where, even though the individual may not seem like they need a lot of support, they really do, because this is like the exploration phase. And even though they may be adults, or maybe they are still teenagers, we want to make sure that people are making good decisions, right? Not just doing this because they feel like they have to, or I've got to do this so that I do identify as LGBTQIA, so I've got to do these things because that's what these people do. No, that's not always the case, right? So just having that support and knowing that you're respected, and just like we would with a teenager, encourage exploration, encourage accepting people and everything, but also encourage making good decisions, healthy choices, and being kind to yourself through all of this. And then we have identity synthesis. This is one aspect of who I am, right? So we're not just saying, we're not entering the room saying I'm gay. We're saying I'm a school counselor who also happens to be gay, I'm a father, but I'm also gay, right? I am a businesswoman who is running a Fortune 500 company. Oh, and by the way, I'm a lesbian, right? That's the part where, you integrate that identity into the rest of your identity. You feel whole, right? And again, that would be the typical progression for somebody who's not facing barriers. But again, maybe you start down the path and then you have a really horrible experience. Well, then that may put you back in the closet and put you back ashamed of yourself and unwilling to kind of express yourself for who you are. Any questions about the phases? No? Okay. So my story, because typically people ask, I'm not going to share the entire thing. I can probably do that in another session. But I did officially come out later in life, right? My official coming out was in October of 2016. I have recently gone through a divorce with my kid's mother, and we were married for about 7 years. And not because of our attractions or anything like that. The marriage just didn't work out. We've known each other since kindergarten. I think we're probably better friends than spouses. And now we kind of butt heads because of custody stuff and all that. But that's got nothing to do with being LGBTQIA, right? So what actually inspired me to come out? Coming out day happens every year in October. I believe it's the 11th. And that day, while I was still a Spanish teacher at Orange High School, I ran the GSA, the Genders and Sexualities Alliance, right? So the support club group for this community of students. And I was blown away by the bravery of these students who were able to tell their story, feeling that they were in a safe space, feeling that they could be themselves, if nothing else, in that room for that day, for that time. And I was still a student, in the counseling program, and I went to my program development class and kind of sat through that. And the interesting thing was the program that I was, focusing on for that was the stuff that I was doing with my GSA. And I thought, it's coming out day. These brave kids did it. So, I left class, got in my car, and then, just hammered away on the keyboard and, made a Facebook post. I know that's not always the best avenue to do it, but it worked for me. It is, right? You reach a lot of people. And, by and large, I had nothing but support. My mother was not supportive, and that kind of breaks my heart, but I can't change who she is. And, I have my biological family, but I also have my logical family. And, we build community with those who love us and support us. And, the saying goes, blood is thicker than water. Well, I don't know, sometimes you get some pretty thick water, right? So yes, my story doesn't necessarily follow that traditional coming out path, right? There were quite a few stages that I blew right through, right? There were some that I lingered on maybe when I was younger and then put them away, and then they came back when I was older, right? So officially, I would say that I identify as pansexual because I am still attracted to women, and I am still attracted to men, and I find myself being attracted to transgender or intersex individuals too. For me, my motto is hearts, not parts. I like to get to know the person, and that's how I fall in love. So yes, I'm currently in a homosexual relationship, right? I'm married to a man, but that doesn't mean that doesn't make me any less pansexual or bisexual or, my current circumstances don't dictate what my identity is, right? And that tends to be, an issue that comes up a lot when people say, okay, well, I'm bisexual. Well, if you're bisexual, then why are you dating someone of the opposite sex? Okay, well, I'm dating them now, but that doesn't mean that if it doesn't work out, I'm not going to be, in a homosexual relationship. Or maybe I'm asexual and I may be emotionally attracted to folks, but I don't have that physical attraction going, and that's okay too, right? So when we talk about that spectrum, right, there's also that 0 mark, right? So asexual folks are part of the community as well, right? They affectionately call themselves aces within the group. But yeah, that could be a topic for the next presentation. Let's see. If we are working with younger folks, right, and this will probably be the last kind of topic we touch on for today, but I would love to come back and talk some more. When we're talking about young folks and the coming out process, whether they be our children or somebody that we're working with at work or in the community or whatever the case is, somebody comes out to you, you are their safe person, right? That if somebody comes out to you, that's huge. It means they trust you. Often with a very, very, very big secret sometimes, right? Something that could be impacting their life, right? Their safety. So it is important to encourage these folks to have a coming out plan, right? Because coming out isn't just saying, I'm this, and then the world just accepts it, right? There are consequences. There are things that happen that may not make it safe for you, right? So, this isn't to encourage kids and young folks and even adults not to come out, but, in the world that we live in, things aren't always the way we'd like them to be, so we do have to think about safety first and come up with that plan, right? Because there are all these different, spheres of influence in our lives, and while I may be able to come out to this group of people, I might not be able to come out to this group of people. And maybe in this group, I can come out to everybody, but this person from the group associates with this person from this group, so that, complicates things. So we always want to, encourage coming out, but also remember what the impact could be, when that happens. And, finally, when we get to self-actualization, this is a huge thing. Everything is just a phase, right? So you always, well, not always, but often hear people say, oh, well, they're in middle school, they're just going through a phase. They don't know yet because they don't have the experience. Well, same thing with career exploration. Same thing with, your financial situation, right? Maybe you are doing really well and then the stock market crashes and you're not doing so well. Every aspect of your identity is a phase. So sure, yes, this middle schooler who's identifying as transgender, it is a phase. But it is a phase right now that could be the rest of their lives. So we don't want to look down on folks for experimenting, and not, experimenting as in going out and doing all the things, but, having that freedom to explore with their heart, having that freedom to just know that, okay, if I am attracted to this person, it's okay, right? And give me the opportunity to find out if I am, and if I'm not, I'm not, right? If I am, okay, well then let me be, right? What's so bad about it, being a phase? What's so bad about it being permanent, right? This is who I am. It doesn't change who I am. So, to talk down on somebody and say that, okay, well, this is just a phase that you're going through. Well, it is, but you're going through a phase and you're going through it. Like, we are all going through different phases of different things in our lives.
Just a quick
Yeah.
comment about that. Yeah, I think one thing you hear in the news that I struggle with a little bit is, what do you do with the pre-pubertal child who identifies as transgender? When you're considering gender-affirming surgeries or hormone treatments. I mean, there is some degree of permanence that occurs with that. So I think some folks do have a little hesitance about allowing that kind of treatment.
Exactly, right? So that's definitely a big topic for our next presentation. But kind of the short and simple answer would be, any stage of that, physical affirmation of your gender identity is going to have, you're going to have a mental health specialist involved. You're going to have perhaps an endocrinologist, a surgeon, depending on which pieces of you want to affirm and how you want to do so. You're going to have different specialists. Most psychiatrists will not sign off on anything permanent until somebody turns 18. So there's a kind of a system that blocks puberty. So they're hormone blockers that kind of put the body on pause to give them more time to kind of figure out who they are, right? And that can be used to, just stop the onset of, traditional puberty, to kind of protect your body from going through all these changes only to be reversed by a surgery or, a hormone replacement or anything like that. But yeah, a lot of times when we do have younger folks identifying as transgender, we won't typically jump the gun and, okay, well, this 8-year-old told me they identify as female, but they were assigned male at birth. Let's go ahead and schedule that surgery, or let's go ahead and, get these hormones started. Right now, they, each case is individual. And, for folks that are transitioning, there are lots of different levels of transition. And we essentially call it a transition team, right? So that includes everybody that works with this individual in their transition. And again, it includes mental health, physical health, pediatricians, endocrinologists, all folks that would be involved with that. I have a friend of a friend, she's a voice coach with children's, their Thrive program. So for kids that are working on transitioning, this person specializes in, okay, well, how do we help your speech, reflect the body that you live in? How do we get you to that point, right? So there are, again, lots of different specialists that are involved in that decision. So, it's not something that we can just make a snap decision for. But yes, that is a very controversial
Yeah, no, that's a good response. Thank you very much for this session. Sorry.
Absolutely.
Kids are welcome.
Yeah.
No,
People are coming and going because
Thanks
of all their
again.
many various jobs, so we're just so grateful you could be here.
Thank you.
And I think almost certainly we're gonna wanna have you back. I just, because of how I process a little more slowly, I kind of wanna give it a little time. Former coworkers.
Sorry.
So that I can make a list of my many questions,
Perfect.
because I'm gonna use this at work too. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so I did, the one that I modified this from, we had a staff meeting at the beginning of the year. There's this huge debacle about gender identity with students.
You guys
So
have a special thing going on up there, don't you, around how school personnel name and work with, particularly your transgender kids and pronouns
Yep.
and whatnot.
Yeah, so there's
So school counselor eyes are on you.
Yep. a section on the law and what the law says. And, quick summary, if we do not, as educators, we don't identify the child the way they like to be identified, we're violating the civil rights law.
You know
And that
what?
trumps any other law that
I
they
thought,
come at
how
you
silly.
for.
I could have done
Yeah.
that myself.
It's- It was
Bottom
refreshing
line, school
and,
counselors are just making these kids alive.
yes.
The next day.
Got a real quick question. I'm on a committee that's working on inclusion and issues of that for the church. Your grounding questions, could I possibly take a snapshot of that? If you could get back to that screen
Yeah,
for
let me
Your
stop
presentation
this.
was wonderful. But we're at a point of just trying to help, folks understand. And when I say folks, I'm including myself. And that's a great place to start. I thought those were wonderful initial questions that everybody can respond to.
We're having a normal reception, we have punch and cookies.
Is it gonna be set up in here or in?
That I don't
That's what I'm
know.
trying to find out.
Asked me to stop this and I don't know.
Oh, I would suggest you have it in a chapel. Rich. I'm thinking it's not gonna be huge, so it probably will be in here.
This is what I'm thinking. So, sometimes I set it up.
Well, I do have it on your screen.
I do, yeah.
Can I
I'll
just
just,
take it off the screen?
Yep.
That works.
Oh, you know where you wanna go?
Oh, it's up there.
New room, yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, this is lovely. Betsy and I counted money in there, and it's really a nice room. Oh, easily, easily.
I already introduced Erin and Tracy. She thinks she would really like to have you come speak with me.
Well, yeah, I normally we have
I
it here, and I
It's here in this church right now.
Well, everybody identifies with one of those.
It's not huge.
All of
I mean, at least it's almost.
We usually don't
Absolutely.
put it in there when it's going.
We're all that
A
unicorn
lot of people
somewhere
are
in there.
coming and going because of various
Thank you.
responsibilities that they have around here. It's, as you would imagine, there's a number of 20 or 30 people who do a lot of the stuff that needs to get done on a Sunday morning. I think it's like they're like, at least 100% buyer. Things that have to go through.
I'm on there.
Thank you, I had to run out, the kids were.
You're okay, thank you for joining.
Okay.
Yeah, so, 4 follow-up questions. No is a perfectly good answer. Is there an email? Because folks may have questions that they don't wanna ask a regular volunteer.
Right.
I don't know how much of a resource you would be interested in or willing to be for those folks.
Yeah.
And what that would look like.
Yeah, these are my.
Should I just hold on to your cards or just feel free to publicize again within the church anything that's listed on the card?
Yeah, but I'm gonna throw on mine because this is school stuff, but,
Some of the things they don't really ask me first.
just drew.com, private, and I know there are other folks that may just want to more questions.
Yes,
It's
yes.
financial.
So cool. And let me just point out the art here, you being a dad, I don't know if your kids have art that you would like to memorialize forever. This lady back here will take your kids' artwork and turn it into a hobby, which I just thought was really cool. I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna go quite that far, but I'm just so glad there's somebody out there doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's as far as I've gotten. So my son.
Well, now that is the millennial version of football.
Yeah.
Let me just move my bangs and smack my forehead. This is awesome. I took a picture of these things that I intend to put on my Facebook page, which is for family friends and family because Sherry always asks us if she thinks it should be something everybody has access to. And as I think we're gonna cover this particular title by your recommendation, rather than saying it's pointing at.
Yeah, I actually did, so I did, I'm the diversity liaison at Berkshire too, so this year I did a book study with staff, so each month we've got a book geared toward different populations, so that's
So
our.
it would you would be recommend?
No.
How many times would you recommend meeting to discuss such a?
It's an easy read, so I don't know how involved in the book versus conversation you get, like, in your get-togethers.
In any of our book groups, like half the people let's read are PhDs in a wide variety of fields. So like there's bright literate people who can just really dig the whatever they're reading. Yes, and there was a pun sort of intent. Because the book group is really fun group and like pretty much we've had a strong social justice kind of theme for the last long while. We've looked a lot at people of color, poverty. We haven't dug real hard into this, but we have a lot of white fragility. It has merged and we've learned here in church, but gay people are white people. So it kind of often, and that feels like a door in to that. And to me, as a person who helps program our education, so I think we're going to do a bit more and just try to connect along the ways. I don't know if you see the book called My Father's Closet. The author is Karen McClintock, and it is the story of a person family who joined this church at the time this building was built, and her dad lived his life in this closet in Indiana because he wanted to have a family, and he wanted to be a church member, and he wanted to live in suburbia. But every year he had a boyfriend, and they both went to receive lunch every day at the family club, and for a week every year they went to sing and saw shows and just ran out, came in for a week out of his life, and then he'd come out and they were like, they had sex just enough time to get 2 daughters, and had a great friendship, but not like a traditional marriage.
Right.
But that's going to be the next book that we do as soon as we're out of plant, because I think that will help folks get people here right now, this moment. Joel tried to explain what he liked to get wiring up?
No, just throw myself in the back. So you know how to stop the live stream? He showed me, but
I know one way that'll definitely stop it. But I could look at a button and see if there's an actual stop.
because he showed it's toward, like it was towards the bottom right. It's
Bottom right. This is the way that I know.
Perfect.
Low tech, but effective.
That's true.
You know, this is how those of us in our late 50s handle tech. I know on, and I know off, and I know restart.
Right, and you know where the outlet is to.
And I know how to plug it in and to make sure that it really is plugged in.
Right.
So yeah, I forgot how much you reminded me of my one stepson.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, he would definitely love those pants. He's now a professor at the University of Iowa in American Studies.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
yeah.
Must be so
And with
proud.
Vasquez, he and his brother and sister were born in Mexico City.
Okay.
Yeah, and he is a native